Well, good evening, good evening. I'm having a little quiet look at some of the strange things that I have. I spoke yesterday a little bit about the the controllers that came with Hornby Dublo, and this is one of those that you put a 12-volt supply from a transformer or a 12-volt battery in there. You've got this wonderful little controller that allows you to apply power to your track, which goes out using those. That's a wonderful little thing, isn't it? Very sort of prehistoric. I wouldn't be scared of putting 12 volts through it because, well, it's 12 volts. Those folk who understand these things will realise that as this is basically a resistance sort of controller, it's not going to give the sort of quality of control that a modern controller will supply. But it's an interesting thing. When we move forward a little bit, slightly closer to today, now this one is defective. It should have a bulb holder and a bulb in there. Again, it's a connector battery and connect to the track. And again, it's got a wonderful sort of, you can imagine a small boy in the 1950s looking at this and thinking he was driving a train. It's actually like the sort of thing you might find on a full-size diesel locomotive, isn't it? This sort of wonderful handle. You can imagine his handle on the hand on the dead man and his other hand on the Westinghouse. Wonderful sort of thing. Let's pop that out of the way. I'm running out of space here. And, oh, crikey. This is Charles Atlas sort of territory now. This is the type of beast that I strongly suggest you don't use. It takes modern power in. Let me see, can I get the lighting so that tells us? Volts, anywhere between 210 and 250 volts at 50 to 80 cycles. So this thing, up a wire like that, you'll notice I did the typical safety man's trick and just cut the plug straight off it. You know, it's taking a lot of current straight up that manky old wire, straight into a metal case. I've not taken one of these apart. And I'm not going to take this one apart because I'm not going to use it. But it's sort of chunky and heavy and, yeah, wonderful thing to look at. Now, on that end, it tells you that you've got, you know, those are sockets for putting a plug into. And A gives you 0 to 12 volts at 10 watts DC. B gives you 12 volts DC, and C gives you 15 volts for working some of the accessories that you could. But C is 15 volt AC. That's a funny sort of thing. But anyway, I just thought you'd like to see these devices. And as I say, I'm going to strongly recommend that these things are consigned to the shelf to be looked at and admired and wondered at, but not to be used. Now, last night I showed you a piece of track not dissimilar to this one. It wasn't actually this one. That's where you put your 12 volts in. 12 volt controlled so that you can vary the speed of your train or your locomotive. And I was quite pleased with myself today. I turned over some stuff and I found a box with lots of pieces of track. It was another box that I'd stacked, and I'm working slowly through the stack. And I thought, yep, that's good. It looks nice. You know, it's all there. It needs a little bit of adjusting, but it's not too sad. And then I picked up another one and I thought, oh, that's good. And then I turned this one over and it's different. I am guessing that underneath that plate is some sort of suppressor, you know, some sort of capacitor or something, because, you know, Hornby started knocking this stuff out in the 1930s, and small boys all over the country were getting it for Christmas right up to sort of 1939. I guess they were getting it in 1940, 41 as well, but second hand or old stock from shops. Production was suspended for part of the war. Production of Hornby Dublo, the factory didn't stop producing things, it just stopped making toys. And then in the 1950s they started knocking it out in huge volumes. At the same time that people were coming home from the war having learnt all about how to operate radar, and they really were buying spare parts for radar sets and building in their sheds television receivers. I kid you not, if you find an ancient copy of Practical Electrics from the 1950s, sooner or later you will find a wiring diagram for how you take pieces of radar kit and you feed it with seriously high voltages. It's got all sorts of capacitors and valves and step-down transformers and all sorts of terrible, terrible things. And you wire it up using some knocked-off wire from the post office, and you built your own television, unless you were rich. Well, of course, the people who bought their children this sort of stuff probably were rich. So they probably didn't buy an old cathode ray tube from a aircraft radar. They probably went to the local high street and they probably bought or rented a television. And they had the television in the downstairs front room, you know, chuck the piano out into the garden, put a television in, and little Tommy was upstairs playing with his Hornby Dublo with a piece of track like that. And every time he wound up the power and trundled his Duchess of Atholl around the track pulling 12 coaches, there was all sorts of lines and marks all over the television. I kid you not, I remember the interference on televisions from running Hoovers and toy trains and various other things. Old tellies were susceptible to that sort of problem. So a lot of people who made electrically sort of motivated toys started putting signal suppressors onto them. And I'm guessing that's what that is. But there we are. And as luck has it, we've got two. So that was something sort of interesting to come across. I also mentioned last night that Hornby produced some wonderful little switches that almost look like the sort of lever frames that Signalbox had. And these switches come in a variety of types. And each type was colour coded, and someone far cleverer than I is going to tell us what all of the different colour codes mean. So there we've got a black one that is missing its screws and bolts. This one shows us the simple interior of it. This one is actually one of those for livening up a circuit. You know, in that position, no power is going through the switch. In that position, it is happily feeding 12 volts to something, whether that be a neutral section on the track bed, or maybe you just turned on all the lights in the station master's house. I don't know. And I was a little bit upset to see that it was missing its bolts and nuts, but you could take the bolts and nuts out and put long studs through, and you could make up a whole I thought I had another one lying here somewhere. I wonder where I put that. You could make up a whole in the box, a whole lever frame of these, which presumably then you put little marks on so you knew what they were supposed to do. Each of them has a different sort of function. Some of them are passing switches, so as you flick the switch it puts a pulse of electricity through. Some of them are a sort of positive on-off switch, but they're colour coded. Now, and I need to find the book that tells us what each of the colours do. Of course, it's quite a simple matter to take the cover off and see what each of them does. And they came in delightful little boxes. One of the great things with all of this sort of stuff, it allowed dads all over the country to tell their faithful wives, maybe they told their unfaithful wives, I don't know what their family circumstances were, but they could tell their wives, no, 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 this is not a toy, this is educational. Little Tommy is going to know all about electricery and all about railway signalling and operation. It teaches logic and it's engineering in miniature. It is not a toy. And presumably the ever faithful wife went back to the kitchen and tied her apron on, and presumably she made bird's custard to go on their apple pie, and everyone was happy. And little Tommy could run his train without interfering with the television.